Hello, everyone. My name is Gil Penalosa, and I am the creator and host of this biweekly webinar series, Cities for Everyone, where every other week I invite fascinating people to talk about interesting subjects that are going to help us create more equitable, sustainable, playful cities so that each one of you, as passionate advocate, will contribute to make that happen. Originally, I'm from Bogota, Colombia, and now I've been living in Toronto for the last 25 years, where I created a nonprofit, 880 Cities, and more recently, Cities for Everyone. And this bi-weekly webinar is a way of giving back. I've been fortunate to have worked in over 350 cities. I want to help people become passionate advocates to create cities that are more equitable, more sustainable, and more playful. Today's guest is fascinating. It's Gia Biagi. Gia was chief of staff of the Parks Department in Chicago. That was number 2 position. And she was number 1 in transportation. Imagine 2 areas that usually have white old men as heads, and now a woman. She was leading both for a few years one, and then for a few years the other. And now it's in the private sector. Gia, thank you very, very much for having accepted the invitation. We are all eager to learn from you about parks and streets and everything in between about making civic impact. Gia, welcome.
Okay, well, it's a delight to be here. Thank you, Gil. Thank you for having me. And it's, it makes sense to me that parks and streets and all the things in between are connected. And I think that's something that you've fundamentally seen throughout your whole career. And that is the gospel, I think, that you preach everywhere. So thank you for all the work that you have done. I just feel great.
Yeah, I say that the sidewalks are the cousins of the parks.
That's
Because
right.
at the end of the day, they're almost the same. In cities, we should take the sidewalks out of the parks department and give it to, out of public works and give it to parks, because in both of them are solid. Okay, now we see full screen parks, streets, and everything in between.
All right. Well, thanks again for having me here. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself and kind of some of my background. And then, when I tried to put together, how much you could possibly talk about parks and streets and all the pieces in between, I tried to distill it down to a couple of insights, things that I've learned over the years that hopefully will be helpful or at least provocative for folks on this call. So thanks again for the time today. So I'm at Studio Gang Architects. I lead what we call our urbanism and civic impact practice. And that means working all over the United States and overseas on projects that are thinking about how do we contextualize architecture? How do we think about the big systems in cities, systems like transportation and open space, and all of those parts of a city? What does that have to do with buildings? And what do buildings have to do with that? But most importantly, what do people have to do with that? How do we put people at the center of this work that we do together? But most recently, I was head of Chicago's Department of Transportation. And so this meant overseeing all 4,000 miles of streets and all of the sidewalks, streetlights, all of the shoreline and waterfront edges, and really trying to be a steward of these pieces of the public way that we own together. But it wasn't just about what we call the hard infrastructure, but it was also about policy. How do we think about freight and the impacts on communities in terms of environmental justice? How do we mode shift, getting people out of cars and onto public transit or onto scooters and bike share? I talked about the work when I was doing it as sort of thinking about going from policies to potholes, right? And all the pieces in between. Because you really have to be able to do the maintenance, do the work every day, get the work done that the public can see in order to create a vision for where we ought to go together on these bigger, more important changes, like how do we achieve mobility justice in our city? So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So I was there for about 4 years. And prior to that, with a stop in between at Studio Gang, where I'm at again, previously, I was at the Chicago Park District, where I wore a lot of hats, from being sort of just a frontline project manager, working in neighborhoods on community plans, all the way up to being head of planning and development for the whole system, and then eventually chief of staff, which meant thinking really about everything from programs and services, like how do we make sure that we have as many kids in Chicago in our summer day camp programs and managing their out of school time, to working on signature civic projects that were reimagining infrastructure, to making sure that we set the table really well for communities to decide what it is that ought to happen to the open space in and around them, and all the way up to more recognizable signature projects that were like Millennium Park and Maggie Daley Park, that were as much about economic impact and tourism and really leveraging what we could do in these signature places to help support the programming that was happening in neighborhoods. So it's been quite a run. And, I really love the title of Gil's session here, Cities for Everyone. And it makes me think about, though, how do we deliver cities for everyone? And what I have learned is that they have to be by all of us. So, from the perspective of someone who's worked in government, who's been in the private sector, when we think about how to deliver the city we want, we need to make sure that as many people as possible who are affected by all of those decisions made every day about parks and about streets and sidewalks and transit and all of these pieces, that we have to create a way for as many people as possible to have a hand in making the city that we want, the city that is for everyone, but again, by all of us. So I'll offer up a couple of really three maybe insights that I think about a lot. And in particular, I'll start with this notion that you start with what's there. And this is something that at Studio Gang, where I am now, that we think a lot about and talk a lot about. How do you look at the world around you with an asset-based mentality? That is, not thinking about deficits and what we don't have, but thinking about abundance and what we do have, and recognizing that you can take what we have together and make it transformative in your city. When I think about what I've had the opportunity to have my hands on in Chicago, and this is a great aerial photo of it, you can see all the pieces. We have open space and streets and buildings and all of these parts. And I bet this is a room full or a webinar full of people who really understand the power of these assets that is far and away beyond just the fact of having it in your city. For example, we know that streets are part of the economic vitality of a city. If we invest in our retail corridors with great benches and lighting and places to gather and places to stay, that actually has a large economic impact on the fortunes of that neighborhood. When we think about how we move vehicles in and around the city or get people to shift to greener, better ways of moving and different kinds of transit, we know that we can have an impact on climate. We can also improve the health of people in neighborhoods by improving the air quality through our choices around transportation. And parks are the same way, right? We know that parks have an exponential impact, not only on physical health, but also mental health and wellness, right? That we know that, a child with a view of green out of their window, we've seen the studies where it lowers ADHD symptoms in children. We know that it lowers the urban heat island, which then helps people feel calm in hot weather and reduces the kinds of behaviors that can lead to conflict. And not to mention the economic impact of parks. And then in between these buildings, right, as we think from an architectural perspective, where I spend much of my day thinking about urban design as this handshake, right, in between the parks, the streets, and the architecture. The buildings, they hold our history. They express something about ourselves. They also are the host of economic development and community development, all of these pieces. And so when we think about all of this as a cohort, right, and there are lots of really smart folks thinking about what we own in commons. When I say that, I mean all of this public way, all of these streets, all of these parks. We have choices to make, and we need to raise the imagination about what these could be. So when we do start with what's there, for example, this is a project in Chicago, the 606 Bloomingdale Trail, that was doing what a number of cities have done now, which is reimagining a former railroad line, 3 miles worth, in a neighborhood that traveled east to west on the north side of our city, and reimagining it to do more for the communities where it resides. And in this case, becoming an incredible trail project, becoming a series of parks that create a connected fabric of open space that enables both movement and mobility, right? People can get from where they are to those meaningful destinations in their life and throughout their neighborhood through this, but it's also a place to gather. It's a place that has all those permutations of what makes parks so important in our lives. And this was one of those moments of combining, right, that infrastructure. We're thinking about streets and movement and rail, and we're thinking about parks and open space, and we put them together, we reimagine them, and they can be all kinds of different things that mean so much more in our cities. But when we start with what's there, we also have to start with data and history and the story of the place where we're working. And what I have in front of you here are two maps of Chicago. On the left is 1970, and these are maps of income inequality. So where we have folks with very high incomes, all the way to middle incomes, all the way to very low incomes. On the left is 1970. On the right is 2017, so relatively present day. So on the left, in the center, you can see the dark orange. That's very low income Chicagoans. And you can see that it starts to spread out where we have mostly middle income Chicagoans spread around our city. And then on the edge of the city, you can see the dark blue, and that's where we have very high incomes back in 1970. That's the map on the left. The map on the right is present day. And you can look at the dramatic change in incomes where we have in the dark orange, that's where we have very low income Chicagoans on our south and west sides. You can see the distribution of poverty across our city in that time period. In the dark blue, you see very high income. Now, this is along our lakefront and our shoreline, excuse me, on the north side of the city. And you can see concentrations of wealth. That is the story of our city. So when I say we need to start with what's there, it isn't enough to identify a piece of infrastructure that could be something else in this place. We also have to nest it in a much more global view of our city and ask, what is the public policy question we are working on? Where should I be looking for these opportunities? Not just where the funding is, not just where philanthropy wants to go, but where does the city need us to go to move the needle on important questions like ending generational poverty. So one of the ways that we used this when I was at the Department of Transportation was to think about the question of mobility hardship and what that has to do with economic hardship. What I'm doing here is thinking about what are the tools that we have to work with. If you're in parks, you have parks to work with. You have all kinds of programs to work with. If you're in transportation, you have streets, you have initiatives, you have mobility to work with. And so we asked ourselves, if we wanted to start with what's there, which is a dramatic need to end generational poverty in Chicago, what does that mean through the lens of the tools that we have in transportation? And so when I was at the Department of Transportation, we created these two maps, which are similar but different. Now, on the right-hand side in the green map, that's a map of economic hardship. It's a little more complex than income alone. It's income, it's also crowded housing, it's also educational levels. And in the darkest green on the green map, that's where you have the highest levels of economic hardship. That's where everything is hard. That is all of those factors plus low income. And you can see it's tracking very similar to that income inequality map I showed you on the south and west sides of our city. And then you can see the middle green where you have middle hardship, economic hardship, and then the lightest color is exactly where that dark blue was on the previous map, where we saw those concentrations of wealth. That's where we have the lowest levels of economic hardship. Okay, that's the map on the right. Now, the map on the left was something new that we created that was looking at something called mobility hardship. This means how hard is it for you to move around in your city? That sounds simple, and in a way it is. But mobility hardship is about three factors. One, that it costs you a lot to move around your city. What does that mean? That means you probably own a car because you don't have viable transit, public transit options near you. Then you're paying insurance. Then you're paying for gas. Then you're paying to repair that car. It costs you more to move around the city. The second piece of mobility hardship is that it costs you more in time. It takes you longer to get from where you are to where you need to be. You're spending more time on the road, more time commuting. That's hardship and mobility hardship. And then the third is that there's a higher level of people with disabilities in your community. That means it's harder to move around. And if your sidewalks aren't great, or if you don't have easy access to alternative transportation, it's very difficult. So that map on the left, and I know I'm spending a lot of time explaining it, but I think it's significant, and it was in Chicago and it could be for other cities. So the colors. In the red on this map, that's where you have the highest levels of mobility hardship. That is where it's hardest to move around. Now, there's no big reveal here. That is it's almost identical. The hardest places to move around from are the same as the areas of our city that have the highest economic hardship, right? The yellow on the map is where you have middle mobility hardship, and then the dark blue, again, where you have the highest incomes, you have the least economic hardship, is where it's easiest to move around. You have the best opportunities for mobility. So in Chicago, what we needed to do was change this map. So as we looked at the infrastructure we had and made decisions about where we were going to expand our bike share, where we're going to do capital projects, where we're going to look for that next amazing rail to trail project, we weren't going to wait for it to find us. We were going to go with intention to those red areas on the mobility hardship map, because that is where people in our city needed us. That's how we use transportation to move the needle on economic hardship in our city. So it led us to places like this in Englewood, that is in the center of that area with mobility and economic hardship. And it opened our eyes to relationships with communities on the ground that, much like that previous project, which is on a wealthier north side part of the city, here, folks had the same kinds of ambitions, and we could recognize the same opportunities because of our map. It enabled us to say we need to be present everywhere, looking for these opportunities and making sure that there's distribution of these opportunities to reimagine, and we are in the process of this, of reimagining what the Englewood line, a different rail line with parks and urban farms right in smack dab in that area of all kinds of hardship, is in the process right now of being redesigned. We got a great federal grant to help move that project forward, and we have a very engaged group of community leadership that are actually leading the design project and holding the contracts, while the Department of Transportation, we're providing technical assistance and we're going to get the federal money. But what's important here is not only are we able to identify these opportunities in transportation and parks combined, but that we're also able to make sure that the community is leading as much as possible. And we're doing what we can to support their ambition. So when we think about these opportunities, right, and we start to have our eyes wide open on what you can do with what you have, we can also arrive at projects like this one. This is a vacant lot in Chicago, and it sure doesn't look vacant anymore. We have 10,000 vacant lots owned by the city in Chicago. And our ability to begin to look toward different parts of the city and recognize that these underutilized pieces of infrastructure and city property could be reimagined for other purposes led us to multiple projects like this on the south and west sides of our city. And you can see here the park and transportation coming together, right? Sometimes we're too bounded by, well, this is what parks does and this is what transportation does. But what we need to do is blur those lines. We need to make it liquid between what we own together and reimagine how it becomes a seamless set of spaces where the streets are actually physically performing the invitation to bring you into these spaces. And this was a project that was one of those really wonderful hands-on efforts where we have folks who live in the neighborhood who are building it, who are painting it, who are owning it, and that kind of level of stewardship, as anyone in parks knows, can happen everywhere. But you can do it together with transportation and with parks and with all of those seams that are in between and create something bigger than each of those would have been alone. And then down to the smallest scale. And you can see how I sort of started, we've talked at a citywide scale, we talked about these large pieces of infrastructure, and we're getting a little smaller down to the vacant lot, and then even down to these moments like this. And I think for me, this was one of the more emblematic moments of coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, where so many cities were thinking about how do you use your streets differently, right? Blurring those lines and thinking about streets as places, not simply as opportunities for movement. They have to do both. And this was a moment where we worked with some folks who run bakeries and flower shops and small restaurants in that area of mobility and economic hardship, where we sought out these partnerships and reimagined the curb lane. Now, the curb lane, that's a technical term. You have your sidewalk, you have your curb, you have where people park, and then you have the travel lane. Now, that where people park is the curb lane. It's probably the most contested space in many cities, because we're all tussling for, how do I fit a bike lane? How do I create parking for the retailers who feel like they need it? How do we make sure that we're getting enough turnover so retailers are doing well? But this was a community that raised their hand and said, we want to start with what we have. And what we have is a curb lane. And what we have are all of the boards that were used to board up our businesses when we experienced all kinds of activity and protest and real emotion around the murder of George Floyd by police officers, that every city in the United States and overseas felt deeply. And these boards that are making up the green curb lane restaurant area were the boards that were used to board up businesses that were damaged during that time of great emotion. And when you start with what's there, right, back to that mantra, it's thinking differently about what is there. What's there are the opportunity to reimagine the tools of board up, to reopen a neighborhood, to turn those materials into something meaningful, to create these spaces that communities identified as meaningful to them. And our job at the city is to say, well, how do I put what I know how to do in service of that idea? So when I say start with what's there, I've talked a lot about the physical pieces of what's there. But what's most important is that people are there, right? We often talk a lot about infrastructure and parks and all of these physical things, but it's the people that know their neighborhood, that can see it through that asset-based lens, right? Through the lens of abundance, who can identify what we could do better together with all of those tools on the table. So the second insight that I'll share that I've learned is that expertise is everywhere. And this is really important for consultants to hear. Being one myself, having been on many sides of this, worked in a nonprofit, worked in communities, been a government official, there are experts everywhere. And often folks are experts who are right on the block. You know, when I worked in transportation, one of the things I learned was that, you know, people in neighborhoods, they know their community better than I ever could. You know, Mrs. Jones, who sits on her porch, who's watching the street all day, who knows all the kids walking by, she knows her neighborhood, she knows that street, she knows her park better than any public official ever will. And that kind of knowledge is expertise. It's not just someone's lived experience, which matters incredibly, but that lived experience needs to be positioned as a kind of expertise that we value as much as we might from a consultant or from somebody who's worked in transportation. And when we think about that, particularly when people are trying to relate their experience, if you think about the day in the life of someone in a neighborhood, right, they're experiencing all kinds of aspects of what we own together, what we live together in a neighborhood in different ways. In transportation, we often think about commuting, right? And how do we get people from where they are to work? It's a big part of cycling planning, has been historically in the United States. And I'll talk a little bit about how we tried to turn that on its head. What we did in Chicago, recognizing that, you know, anybody can draw a commuter route on a map. It doesn't mean that it's a safe route. It doesn't mean that it feels good. And it doesn't mean that it opens up the pool of people who might want to ride their bike to work or wherever else. What we learned by listening to people in neighborhoods was that it isn't about going to work. And I think any transportation nerd like me will tell you, 4/5 of all trips on public transit are not to work. They're to other places. They're to meaningful destinations in your life. And so when we think about the expertise that people have, and we think about trying to connect the dots between a park and the street and the places people go, the better question is, what are the meaningful destinations in your life? How do you get there? How do we help you to shift, let's say, from using your car to bikes? If I can think better with you together about what is the network that you want to participate in. And that idea dramatically transformed the way that we planned and rolled out our bikeway strategy. We had a heavy commuter-based mentality. And looking at, for example, here on this map, where you can see in the blue, where we had mapped out bike routes before our shift. But then we adopted a different way of thinking about it, that meaningful destinations idea, and creating a neighborhood network strategy that meant spending a lot of time in neighborhoods to unpack that local expertise and develop a network that actually looked like this. It dramatically changed the network that we were planning to build by spending time with folks and just asking that simple question: what are you trying to do in your life? How do I put my tools in service of that? And we ended up, and this is again in those areas of mobility and economic hardship in our city, developing new kinds of networks and bringing new folks into the tent on changing the way they moved around the city, because now it was a meaningful network. Now it was getting them to the places that mattered in their lives, not a sort of top down, how do I get you from your house to your job alone? And that kind of thinking, I think, is nested in how we think about power and we think about stakes. And it's nested in how we invite people to a table and look around the room and think about who's not there. So many of those neighborhood network cycling strategy meetings would not have worked if we were only talking to the same folks we always talk to. There are folks who always show up. And when we think about the folks who are coming to our meetings, we're often working with folks that are in this quadrant. So you're looking at a power and stakes quadrant, and this might be familiar to folks. I didn't make it up, but it's helpful to me when we look at the power axis. And so at the top is high power, going north to south, and then east to west we have the axis that is stakes, meaning this project matters to you in some way. So in this quadrant we have folks who have high power and they have high stakes, right? Who are these people? They are mayors or councilmen. They are the folks who have run community-based organizations that have a lot of influence. And we're often talking with folks who have both things. They have the ability to have influence and they have a stake in the outcome. And so you need those folks at the table. But what I've learned, it's very important to try to find the folks who have a stake, but don't have power. They're not with an organization, maybe not even with a block club. How do you make sure that we get that kind of expertise to the table? One, it comes from identifying who is at the table, but then to be thinking, who doesn't have power, who doesn't think they can influence this, but the choices we make here will have an influence on their lives. And that's what you're really trying to make sure you have present at the table. That's the kind of expertise that has to sit alongside whoever the consultant is and whoever the elected representative is. It's a way of checking that and making sure you're getting that perspective. And I think this is a project, and I think we've got, I suspect my colleague Carol Coletta is on the line, but this is a great project I think you heard about recently. It was transforming Tom Lee Park in Memphis into an incredible civic asset that its design and its operations and its programming is drawn from a cacophony of responses from people all over the city of Memphis. And as we, when I was at Studio Gang, we supported the work of the Memphis River Park Partnership on this project. And one of the challenges was, how do you get a whole city that has a stake in something that's right on the edge of it to engage in that conversation? And so one of the lenses we put on it was the who's not at the table lens and who has a stake but maybe doesn't have power. And so one of the things that we had done was engage with schools and community-based organizations and getting young people to the table not just in a, let's create a list of people who we need to make sure we talk to, and we're gonna make sure we talk to kids, and then we're done with it. But this was meant to be what I call a longitudinal engagement, that it was creating some scaffolding, a framework for young people who were paid to be involved in the project. And that's very important, that there needs to be reciprocity for, if you want the intellectual capital of people to be engaged in a project, you need to pay them, and more than pizza. And that's fine. We can feed people at community meetings. But if you really want to make sure that you are valuing what folks can offer, that's a really important way to show that and demonstrate that respect. So with young people in Memphis, not only were they part of our design sessions, but they also developed relationships with folks on our design team that lasted far beyond the project itself. But they became not just ambassadors for the project, but actually consultants in their own right. So developing their surveys and getting information from neighborhoods that were far flung from the waterfront. And I think, we've done this also in projects in New York and in other cities. And the key is really taking the folks who have some power, like consultants and others, out of the room and handing over to young people or to other groups, hey, here are some questions we're hoping that we can get answered. But we recognize that, just like anyone in social sciences or anthropology would tell you, right? The person asking the questions often has power, is framing the whole discussion, and influences the way people answer. And so we created on this project and others an opportunity for, in this case, young people to have their own meetings, to go do your own surveys, and please come back and share what you've learned. And it made a real difference in this project, and it can make a difference in work that you do in your life. We did this also in Chicago in the Department of Transportation, where we did a strategic plan, but we actually paid our 30 most active community groups, critics and advocates and all kinds of folks to have their own meetings about us, without government, and then to give us in an unvarnished way what were the things that we could do to move the needle on equity in our city. What were we failing at? What could we get better at? And by taking ourselves out, we made the work better and more meaningful, not just to the city, but to everyone involved. All right, so the last insight that I'll share is that trust is what you're building. At the end of the day, I like to say, if you're an architect, a building is not a victory. Having a plan on a shelf isn't enough, but that these processes, when we think together about how to use the infrastructure that we have differently, when we have these opportunities to have a conversation about our aspirations together, what the most important thing that you can build in the end is trust. And I think about this a lot from an experience that I had in Chicago at the Park District a long time ago, where we were working on a park project, and this is, a diagram of it. And on the bottom half of the park, you had all these great facilities, the playgrounds and the field house and all kinds of programs and this and that. But on the top half of the park is where all the kids lived. They lived on that north side of the park, and the kids would not come to the south side of the park, right? And so, put on your transportation hat and you look at this and say, well, it's got to be the road, right? The road, it's impassable. It must be really difficult to cross. And it's not a great road. It really is hard to cross. And we were spending time trying to listen, trying to understand. And what we realized is it wasn't the road. In fact, the road itself physically and what it was doing had nothing to do with why kids wouldn't cross. And the kids wouldn't cross the road in the end because the road was actually a territorial line. It was a gang line or a crew line where rival gangs had decided that that road was an impassable barrier for kids who lived on the north side of the park, an invisible barrier. So the only way, though, that we were able to understand that was by spending lots and lots of time in conversations that weren't even about that road and our challenges with getting young people to come to the programs across the street, but being present building relationships at that local level with the park supervisor and the staff, and just developing a relationship that wasn't just about the question that we had, but was a relationship that had to be sustained over the long term for the number of questions and conversations that we would have over a lifetime in that park. And that's what got us there, to better understand the context we were working in. Didn't solve it, but it certainly helped us to really understand what some of the challenges were and maybe where we needed to start. And when I think about the work in transportation and how we build trust, and one of the things that we did in Chicago with the transportation department was develop what I call scaffolding. So often we are engaging with communities in a crisis, or when there's a project and there's money, and we're doing these things in this sort of, just in time delivery. We have this money, we got to spend it on this. Let's have a meeting. But what's more meaningful is when you create sort of the architecture of relationships that have to last a long time, like with that previous example. And that should be the goal. That's the challenge, I think, really, for cities. And in Chicago, in transportation, we had a situation where we had these two committees. It was the mayor's bike advisory council and the mayor's pedestrian advisory council. And they'd been in place for more than a decade, maybe 2 decades, and had become these places where, the city would come and talk about projects, and then folks who had enough power to be represented there were in the room. And it seems crazy now to talk about cycling and pedestrians in 2 separate rooms, but that's what was happening. And they became these weird little fiefdoms. And so what we did as part of our strategic planning process was create something different. And we created the Chicago Mobility Collaborative. The idea was that we would create that space to talk about all of these intersectional issues. We can talk about parks, we can talk about streets, we can talk about pedestrians, talk about cyclists, we talk about vehicles, but that we needed a place where anyone could come and where we could co-create the agenda from meeting to meeting, and have a place to engage in these long-term conversations about mobility and about transportation and transit and traffic crashes and all of these challenges that we have together. And it was a very painful process. I will tell you that many folks who were on those bike advisory councils or pedestrian advisory councils felt like they were losing some power by not having those closed rooms anymore. But in creating something that exists for forever and ever, hopefully, and I created a position, a director of outreach and engagement at a transportation department, whose job it is to help make sure that communities are defining the agenda. And communities are also presenting, and they're taking you for a walk on their neighborhood. And we're really co-creating the long-term agenda for transportation and mobility in Chicago by not making it project-based, by not making it just of the moment and trying to get everybody in the room on a schedule. And it's completely changed the conversation in Chicago, and it's created a space for us to think differently. You can't raise the imagination of what is possible with all of these tools and all of these assets together unless you create places for these conversations to happen that are welcoming and inviting and continuous, that you can miss a meeting, it's okay. You're not gonna not be able to influence something that could happen in your neighborhood. And in fact, you're going to help be transformative across the city. And I guess part of our secret plan too was we wanted people who were working on one side of the city on a similar issue and other side of the city in a community-based issue to be in the same room with each other and build a strong network of advocates and of neighborhood block clubs that didn't have to operate in these sort of small spaces and only focused on their own neighborhood, but that they could share information and share best principles and share good practices across our city. And for us, that's fundamentally how you're going to move that bigger map, right? At the end of the day, when we think about, if we think about our infrastructure and our parks and our programming and all of these things that we know how to do, whether you're in government or in the private sector or Mrs. Jones sitting on her front stoop, that when we can pull all these together, we can have the most dynamic cities possible. We own all of this together. And so it's up to us to create a set of principles that work for us in our city that hopefully are starting with what's there and recognizing abundance, that treats everyone as an expert because they do have something to bring, and that really enables us to pull all of what we know how to do together to move our cities forward on these policy questions and of these challenges that we all care about. So thank you. It was longer than I thought. Sorry, Gil. But I'll leave it there, and thanks for the opportunity to share.
Yeah, you have hundreds of people from over 30 countries, and they want to know how to make a civic impact. What would be your call to action? Some are elected officials, some are public sector, private sector, some are retired. And they said, okay, I love the idea of parks and streets and making a civic impact. Okay, what should I do? How to move from hopeless to hopeful, and how to participate, how to be active?
Yeah, I think what showing up is one thing, right? So be present, and not just when the city is having a meeting, but be present at a very hyper local way in your neighborhood. These are the smallest things that help us build. You know, we talk a lot about social capital, right? When we think about Robert Putnam's work and building trust between neighbors. So when there's, you know, a crisis, we can act. But I like the idea, like build civic capital. So by showing up, working on these small things in your neighborhoods, you can develop, it's like power that can be developed across neighbors to be put into action when there is something, when there is a civic project. So I think, you know, call to action, be present, show up at things, stick around after meetings. My father, who was a small town mayor, used to tell me the most important part of a meeting is after it's over, because that's when we can stop all the, you know, the formal part of it and be present and talk to one another and really understand things and spend time. So it's show up, create time, and listen really well. I think that's, you know, those three things alone will get you pretty far, and you'll figure out what to do.
Thank you, Gia. And I tell you a fourth one. The video of Gia's presentation is going to be available 2 days from now on gpenalosa.ca. Please share it with decision makers, elected officials, with advocates, with media. Share with as many people as possible, because I think that everybody can learn from this amazing presentation. Gia, thank you very, very much. We hope that you are just on loan to the private sector, but eventually you're going to get back in doing other things. But even from the private sector, really we need to create cities that are more equitable and sustainable from all sides. Sometimes it might be in the public sector, other times in the private, and also with people like Gia that is so generous. She's on different boards of directors of different civic organizations, and that is also something that everyone could do. So I hope to see Gia and everybody 2 weeks from now on bicycling, Copenhagen and Barcelona. Thanks. Have a wonderful day.
Take care. Thank you.
Gia, thank you very, very much. What a fascinating presentation. You provided so many examples, so much knowledge. I hope that everyone that watches this video will share it with decision makers, elected officials, with city staff, with advocates, with media, with friends, because there is a lot to learn. For example, your chart where you presented the power and how much stake they had on issues, and how do we need to listen to everyone in the conversation, the children, the youth, the older adults. How do we must focus on equity, on the neighborhoods that have been served the worst, where they're having the biggest issues, where there is a lot more poverty. How to use mobility as an equity issue. So Gia, thank you very, very much. I hope that everyone will come out inspired to show up and help create the changes. We certainly learn a lot. Everyone, I'll see you 2 weeks from now. every other Tuesday, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you.